Thanks everybody for coming on this snowy day. So I'm going to be speaking about a personal project I've been working on for a long time. It's something I care a lot about, and I'm here to talk about it. It's called the Memex. But before we start, there's a bit of a public service announcement. So this is not my laptop. This is Paul's laptop. My laptop shuts down every 15 minutes. So I think it's on the. If you have a 2015 laptop that you want to sell me, talk to me. I'm not really sold on the new one. Ah, Ted, thank you. Cool. So the previous talk had a lot about history. I think we went back to 2007. I'm going to start my talk by going even further back. I'm going to do some history with an exclamation mark. We're going to go back to the 1930s. So like a lot of black and white photos. If you don't like history, you can go home. But there's going to be a lot of history. So we start here. The character I'm going to be talking about, his name is Vannevar Bush, and he was an engineer and inventor. He worked at MIT in the 1930s, and he built some of the first analog computers. So these were giant, like room-sized machines, and the problem that they generally solved was calculus. So here's an example of one of the machines that he built. So the operator on the right-hand side is actually tracing a curve, and that and the integral is calculated by the motion of the curve. So these were some really cool early computers. They were 100% mechanical analog computers. They were built in the 1930s. And Vannevar Bush was obsessed with building these things. So we move on to the 1940s, and something really big happened to the world, and that was World War II. So every country was pulled into this giant conflict, and all the research and scientific development of the world became reoriented towards wartime efforts. And there was a problem. There was this incredible amount of information being produced. So people who weren't on the war front, they were back home producing information, so reports or paperwork or information for new bureaucracies. So you can just imagine some of the information that was pouring out of these new wartime bureaucracies. Here's a cool picture. Here's another picture, just showing like the roomfuls of information being generated. So we go back to our character, Vannevar Bush, and his job during the World War II was to actually take all the research and scientific development that was happening and read all the reports, understand it, and translate that into recommendations that he would give the president in terms of how to allocate funding for research. And every day across his desk, he would get paper and reports and research to read, and he'd have to understand it all. And it was a big problem for him. He said, we're being buried under our own product. So what he meant was we have all these tools for generating information, like new typewriters or all these tools for creating information, but the tools to understand it and to make sense of it weren't keeping pace with what he needed. So when the war wrapped up, he put his engineer hat back on, and he had built a lot of analog computers, as I showed earlier. So he's like, I think I can solve this problem of information overload. I'll just build a machine for it. So he thought about it, and he published his thoughts in an essay called As We May Think. That was from 1945. And he called his device the Memex. That was just kind of a made-up term. And this is a picture illustration of what it might have looked like. So a desk-sized device, it would have been about this size. You'd have a microfilm library inside of it with all your library and your information, your reports, your correspondence. There would be two screens at the top, and you would punch a code and get that report on your screen. And here's how he described it. He said, a Memex is a device, individual stores their books, records, communication, and then a user could search through it or navigate it or really understand their personal library this way. So it would have these cool add-on devices. This is a stylus for adding notes into the Memex. This is an audio recorder where you can add audio notes into the Memex. It even would come with this cool clip-on camera. You'd wear it in between your eyes, and you could add pictures into your Memex. So it's completely encompassing like the information that you would come across, and it would all go into one central place. And one of the most interesting things about the Memex was that Vannevar Bush said the human brain files by association, and he wondered if a machine could reproduce this structure. So instead of having alphabetical indexes or topic indexes in our brains, we think by association. So where we were, who we were with, what we were doing around the same time. And Vannevar Bush really wanted a device that kind of had that graph-like structure of memory. So if you can imagine the dots representing nodes of information in the Memex, Vannevar Bush said that as a user navigates through these nodes, the structure would emerge, and you could use that later on use it later on for navigating or searching later on. So here's the unfortunate thing about the Memex. Does anyone want to guess what the number is here? 0, I heard a 0. So yeah, the Memex was never built. It was purely a conceptual device. It had a big impact on history, but it was never actually built. So when I heard about the Memex, I was extremely sad. I wanted a Memex. Like it made me really sad that this thing had never been built. So just a bit of historical background about me. I'm an information pack rat. So if I ever generate information or come across it, I want to keep a copy of it. So this started early. This is my grade 5 journal, and I've been kind of journaling on and off since then. This is my report card from kindergarten that I scanned and kept around. I started keeping all my movie stubs, for example, as another example. So I have kind of an unbroken list of like every movie I've watched. Back before Google Maps, I started tracking my walks through the city, so you can see the colors here representing different like routes I took through the city. Horrifically, I even kept my MSN logs from high school, so this is an example of a really deep conversation with a friend I had. Obviously the majority of the stuff is not worth keeping, but I just figured there might be a use for it at some point. But as we go into this digital era, we have more and more information services just generating personal information. And it just represents an overwhelming amount of personal data to archive and to organize and manage. So I thought about it for a while. There's a couple of solutions. The most obvious one maybe is to talk to the therapist about why I have a compulsion to keep all this information. But being a software developer, I had a different solution. I decided to solve this problem with JavaScript. So I decided the Memex was this cool historical idea that was never built. Wouldn't it be cool if I tried to build a new modern version of it with JavaScript? So I'm going to just go over like how I built it, and I'll do a demo. It's not a live demo, unfortunately, because my laptop is not working, but I took some videos that I'll show. So yeah, I'm going to talk about building my Memex. So then the first step is gathering the data. Like this has been the most complicated part. So I have all my reading and browsing history, almost like a decade worth of that, reading sessions as well. I have things I consume, like the photos I look at or create, the videos I watch, a log of all the podcasts I listen to. So I have all these importers or scrapers pulling in information about this stuff. I have my location history coming from my phone. So this is a pretty unbroken record of like how I move around the city or where I am. And then I have all my messaging and social interactions pulled in. And then a lot of like just soft data, like journaling or notes that I take or photography that I generate. So yeah, we're going to go to the not so live demo, but hopefully you get an idea of like what I've built. So this is kind of like the basic view. It's all oriented around queries. So at the top we have the query that says verb liked. So this represents like the graph that I'm looking for, the subgraph that I'm looking for, and in the bottom I have results. So here I am just navigating through the results of these are things I've liked over time. So they're coming from different places like Twitter. I can change it to YouTube. So this is now just scoping it down to all the videos on YouTube that I've watched, that I've liked actually. So I can do another thing. So I can generate a query for, so this is my listening history, and now this is doing a query for all the podcasts I've listened to. So I execute this query, and then I get a log of the podcasts I've listened to. You can get an idea of like what kind of information I pull in. It's easier to do a demo because I'm in sync. Okay, so on the left side, I have results over time. You can see and I can go back to August 2018 and see results from there. If I noticed I listened to a podcast about Aretha Franklin, I can also search for a podcast I listened to, which is what's happening here. So this will return podcasts I listened to that mention Aretha Franklin. So there's a lot of different ways I can navigate this personal history. So everything is in a graph. I just changed the way it's displayed. So everything's in a graph, and I can use this graph to navigate through the history. So I'm going to do another query. This is a query where I'm going to go through my GitHub liked activity. So when I start a repo, I have a log of that. So I can describe the subgraph in my Memex that I'm looking for. So in this case, I'm looking for repositories that I've liked, and that results in the repositories. But then I can add another traversal. So this is now going through the tags on GitHub, and it's showing repositories about Electron that I've liked on GitHub. And then I can view the graph structure underneath. So in the middle is the Andrew Lewis node that represents me. And then these are the repositories and tags that kind of are coming out of this query. You can see an example of like how I can navigate through my personal history through this graph structure. So what I'm going to do now is try to remember what I had in the video. Okay, so I'm doing a search for JavaScript. So this is everything I've done in JavaScript, like across time. So you can see like a lot of it is browser history. But then I can actually go back into, I can graph it, so these are results over time. And what I'm now doing is doing a graph of different types of activities I've done around JavaScript. So a lot of it's like browsing, messaging. And then I can go back and see like the first interactions I had with JavaScript. So let's go back to 2003 when I was like, just figuring out these computer things. And these are some of my first interactions with JavaScript. So this was like you could paste JavaScript into your, as a bookmark, and then you get like a pop-up. So this was my first JavaScript that I wrote back in 2002. So like it's kind of fun to explore early conversations or early encounters with a topic. Like I feel like an expert in JavaScript now, but it's a nice reminder that I really didn't know what I was doing back then. And like I think that's like it's a good humbling experience to be able to have so much personal history to go back and see. So I don't remember what I have a video of. Oh yeah, so yeah, I have like this example here of how I thought JavaScript might be able to do something on a DVD, and like I was completely wrong about what JavaScript was. But again, it's nice to be able to see like, kind of like what I was like back in the past. So another thing I can do is I have all my bash command line history in here. So this is a search for everything I've done on the command line. So it's pretty useful. Like obviously we have kind of our bash history available. But the nice thing about this is because I have other types of data, I can always collate it. So here's an example. I use the Gifsicle tool for creating animated GIFs, and I never remember the flags that I use or the order. So I can do a search for all the times I ran that command. That's cool. So I can see all the different types, the flags that I've used. But this is like what we have in bash history. But the thing that my Memex gives me is the ability to see like results on a timeline. So I can see the Stack Overflow articles I was reading at the same time. Or I could pull up like who I was with or where I was, like for additional context around like what I was doing or how I learned something. Another thing I can do is just go over my my movements through the city. So we're at King and Berkeley right now, and as I got here, I was like, oh, I haven't been here in a while. So I can do a search for all the times I've traveled past this point in my system. So these are my bike rides around the city. And what we have on the right side here is just a graph of every time I've moved past this lat long. So it's a pretty cool way of just exploring like personal history, or like if I'm traveling to a city that I've been before, I can see like areas that I want to go to. I can also, I think it's going to go, okay. It's easier to do this live actually. So I can also do like visited, so like see the times I've actually visited near this corner. So there's a coffee shop nearby. And I remember that my friend Tom works upstairs at the Globe and Mail, and we had a beer at Betty's. So I can see like the timeline of like me hanging out with Tom, the fact that I spent money on food, had tacos, the fact that I read a book while he was late, and so I have this kind of complete timeline of like what that day was like. And it's fun to just like have that history accessible and available to to go back in time. So for each one of these queries that I have on the screen, I can build dashboards or see the data in different ways. So this is an example of one I just created for like my biking. So I have different ways of visualizing this information. I have like a calendar view, like a map view. I'm moving around. This is like a query for all videos, I think, that mention cycling. And the one on the left, which I should have scrolled up to, is actually just a correlation view. So I'm correlating my minutes on my bike with like my mood. So I can do all these kind of funny correlations or visualizations of my data. So here's another example of me just building a dashboard really quickly. So I'm going to do one for coding. So I'm creating a coding dashboard, and I can just add cards and queries into that. So what I'm doing here is making a card that is all the repositories that I've liked on GitHub. So I'm going to change the card type, save the card. Oh, sorry, it's hard to keep in sync with my video. So now I have a list of cards of the repositories I've liked. I'm going to add another card for, all the times I've done RF node modules, just to get an idea of like how frustrated I am with JavaScript over time. So that will turn into a nice graph of my, frustration with JavaScript. And similarly, I can do another, it's coding related, so how many times I check Hacker News over time, maybe as a rough gauge of procrastination. So what I'm doing here is slowly typing in news.ycombinator.com and graphing out the results and creating the card of, related to those visits. Or I can even just do something simple like how many minutes of working, like dev work have I done, and I can create like a calendar view of that. And I can change the size and save the card. So quickly, I can take all these queries I was doing and put them on a dashboard and like have them available that way. So, like as another fun example, like I track my food eating. So if I might remember that I was reading a book and eating a burrito, and I don't remember what book I was reading, but I remember that I was trying to find a quote. So I can put on a heat map of like where I've eaten burritos just to jog my memory of like the times I've done it in hopes of finding this book quote that I'm looking for. So I turn on the burrito heat map, and as I'm scrolling through my burrito history, I'm trying to jog my memory of like where I was, which burritos I've eaten. And then I notice on the map, I noticed I was at Tommy Thompson Park, and like maybe that was where I was reading the book. So I can go back and see the context of time. So I was at the park, I was reading the book, I found the book that way. And then I can also see like the things I was doing while, in this memory. So the quotes that I saved, the photos that I took, the burrito that I ate. And just like it's nice to be able to use all aspects of my personal history to navigate backwards and forwards and get access to like my brain and my kind of like have this representation of my brain in a system. Yeah, so that's the demo. I wish it could be live because I could do a little bit more, but that's what I built with my Memex. So before going to Q&A, that's the end of the demo. I'm just going to just talk really quickly about like how it's been put together. So the rough structure is it's a desktop app. It's running in Electron. And then we have two parts running in that. We have the importers, and these are a series of scripts or scrapers or API integrations that pull data, personal data. And then I have the interface. And that talks to an API, which talks to a database. So the fancy graph database I'm using to do all this is called Postgres. You might have heard about it. And it's, I was trying a few of the graph databases, but ultimately Postgres is rock solid and can do almost anything you want. So I've been super happy using Postgres. For the API, I'm using Rails, and this is Toronto.js, so I just have to say it. The more JavaScript I do, the more Rails I love. So Rails always works. It's always there for me, and it's always predictable. But alas, I can't do all of it in Rails. So for the interface, I'm using Ember.js. Ember doesn't really get a lot of credit these days. It's still around. It's still in pretty good shape. It's very stable. The upgrade cycles are very predictable. Things don't break on you all the time. And I know most people have moved on to other frameworks, but I'm really happy using Ember. And like, there's a really good, strong community around it. And it gives you a lot of conventions, which are, that gives you structure. And you don't really have to reinvent the wheel all the time. So I love Ember still. As I mentioned, Electron kind of holds everything together. And then the importers are, like a lot of them are Ruby scripts, but I'm rewriting a lot of them in Node scripts just that they can live a bit better inside Electron. So just really quickly, like some of the hard parts. Like obviously, I put a lot of time into the interface, so there's a lot of work in like these visualizations and like building the D3 integrations or the components. But a lot of this work has been conceptual. So like, how do I have a schema, like a graph schema that represents all aspects of my life, both offline and online? Like, so I have to capture things about like what I'm eating, but I also have to capture, a message on Slack. So like, what are the nodes, what are the edges? And trying to create a schema for that has been a lot of work. But really the hardest part has been just getting access to my own data. So like, I really thought I could solve this problem one time, just build all the importers and kind of like move on to the more interesting problems. But really, almost all my efforts has been around just gathering data. And it's kind of a frustrating problem because it's my own data, it's my own personal history, and it's been incredibly difficult to get access to it. There's a lot of categories of problems. Like, first of all, there might not be an API for something for personal information I'm after. So this is the Kindle. There's no API for Kindle. So if you want to get your quotes from the book you're reading, you have to scrape Kindle. That's the only way to get it. Even if there's an API, it might not be designed for me, like as a user of the data. So this is my iMessage history. I have to kind of reverse engineer this iMessage SQLite database and see how it's been put together and build an import around it. So it's really frustrating. Even if there's an API, a public API, it might not be a good one. Like Twitter is really the worst API that I'm using, and there's a whole bunch of problems. Just to highlight one of the many problems, if you want to pull in your favorites from Twitter, the list doesn't actually come in sorted. It comes sorted by the created time. So if I discover a tweet from 2012, let's say, that's not going to show up at the top of the list of the importer list. So I really have to page backwards through time to notice that new tweet, and the rate limits are really slow. So it's just it's an exercise in frustration to get this data. So another example is I wear a Fitbit, and the Fitbit gives me like sleep data or heart rate data. there's a really important thing that's missing from this Fitbit data. If you squint hard enough, you might notice it. There's no time zones in the Fitbit API. So if you're traveling in an airplane and you go across a time zone barrier, Fitbit will sync when you land, but there's no record of when the timestamp has changed, and there's no time zone in the API. So really, your data is actually worse than useless. So it's actually really dangerous because I might have a sleep log in the middle of a browser session. It's very hard to build a timeline around data without time zones. So here's a complaint of someone discovering it for the first time. So even if there is a good API available, it might not last forever, and this is something I've seen over the years I've been working on this project. So Instagram, with almost no warning, just killed their API entirely. This was in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. They just freaked out and removed their API entirely. So you can see it was deprecated immediately, almost like no warning. Another example is YouTube. So I want to be able to have a log of all the YouTube videos I watch. So again, without any warning, YouTube just killed this endpoint without really explaining why or what the motivations were. And I kind of like this forum post. So the mission to organize information, and someone says, "Did you just forget about this?" Which is true, and nobody from Google replied, which is also very frustrating. So you might be thinking, GDPR has given us a lot of access to our personal history through data exports. And this is true, but GDPR, in my experience, it gives you access, it gives you files in a format that's not really good for machines and not really good for humans. It's kind of in that uncanny valley. So here's an example from Facebook. So Facebook gives me access to my message history, let's say. So in May 2018, this is what the JSON file for this record looks like. In September 2018, the format just changed. So when I downloaded the zip file again, the JSON structure changed again. And there's no versioning or record of this change. It just broke my importer. And I had to quickly go figure out why my importer broke and then rewrite my importer and handle that change. Or another thing that happened is that they just started using 1,000 millisecond precision timestamps, and there was no advanced warning about this or documentation of the change. So it's been really tricky to just kind of stay on top of these arbitrary formats. And a question I ask myself all the time when doing this is, am I doing something that I shouldn't be done? This project sometimes seems like an exercise in futility. And I think in some ways, yeah, the web wasn't really designed to be used in this way, and it's really frustrating. I wish it would be. But I take a lot of inspiration from the original Memex just to tie it back. Because the Memex was really not supposed to be built. It was a weird device. Computers were room-sized. They were there to solve hard problems like calculus, not someone's personal information library. So I get a lot of inspiration from that, and it keeps me going even when it's very frustrating. So Vannevar Bush had a quote about the Memex, and he really wanted it to be a machine for the mind. So this idea that it's almost a prosthetic that we have that allows us to have access to our memories and help us do things that we wouldn't be able to do without it. And he ends the essay by talking about as a human molds the machine, i.e. as he builds this machine, he's interested in seeing how the machine remolds the human mind. So it's kind of a cool feedback loop. While as I use my Memex and I develop it and use it, a lot of capabilities or use cases kind of emerge from the system. So I'm having a lot of fun building it. So if you're interested in using this, my hope is to launch it mostly as an open source project. I have a newsletter you can sign up for to be notified. Basically the problem I want to make sure is that I don't hold people's personal information, and I'm building kind of like a launch around that.